Hello, and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Seán Pieper, and my guests today are Drew Hendry, the MP for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey, and the SNP's economy spokesperson at Westminster, and Hugh Marshall, journalist and activist for Welsh independence. Welcome both to the programme.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
We begin our programme today with an update on the conflict in Ukraine, day 816 of the war. The Ukrainian government has said that Russian shelling targeted civilians in two cities in the northeastern region of Kharkiv on Saturday. Ukrainian prosecutors said they were investigating as a potential war crime a Russian airstrike on a residential area of the regional capital, Kharkiv, in which 6 civilians were wounded, including a 13-year-old girl, 16-year-old male, and an 8-year-old. Moscow denies deliberately targeting civilians, but thousands have been killed and injured since its February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In Vovchansk, a city just 5 kilometres from the Russian border and about 70 kilometres to the northeast of Kharkiv, Ukrainian prosecutors said Russian shelling killed a 60-year-old woman and injured 3 other civilians. 2 civilians, aged 70 and 83, were killed when trying to leave Vovchansk by car, the Kharkiv regional prosecutor said. Only 100 residents remain in the town, which is now largely in ruins. Across the border, in Russia's Belgorod region, Moscow's defense ministry said its forces shot down a Tochka-U missile fired by Ukraine late on Saturday. Belgorod regional governor Vyacheslav Gladkov said a Ukrainian drone attack injured a woman and a man in the village of Petrovka. They were treated for shrapnel injuries in Belgorod. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reported successes by troops fighting a renewed Russian assault in the Kharkiv region. He said in his nightly video address that Ukrainian forces were on surer footing. The occupier is losing its infantry and equipment, a tangible loss, even though, just as in 2022, it was counting on a quick advance on our land, Zelensky said, referring to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in February of that year. His remarks come a day after he was warned Kyiv has only a quarter of the air defences it needs to hold the front line. A divisive mobilisation law in Ukraine came into force on Saturday, as Kyiv struggles to boost troop numbers. The legislation, which was watered down from its original draft, will make it easier to identify every conscript in the country. It also provides incentives to soldiers, such as cash bonuses or money towards buying a house or car. Zelensky also signed 2 other laws on Friday, allowing prisoners to join the army for the first time and increasing fines for draft dodges 5-fold. Russia's defense ministry said its forces captured the village of Staritsa in the Kharkiv region on Saturday, 8 days after the new Russian push in the area began. Meanwhile, Zelensky said that his forces repelled an assault further south in the eastern Donetsk region around Chasiv Yar, a city seen as a key target on Russia's campaign. In the village of Stanislav, in the southern region of Kherson, Governor Alexander Prudkin said a Russian drone strike killed a man about 40 years old and injured a woman. Now, turning to the situation in Gaza briefly, we have an update that at least 35,386 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, with 79,366 wounded, both of which figures are obviously estimates based on the utter destruction in the area. As the humanitarian disaster worsens, we've seen this week the construction of this aid delivery pier by the US, though the UN has repeatedly warned that this is simply not sufficient unless it is carried out in conjunction with the delivery of aid via land. Drew, I'd just like to sort of get your perspective around what the mood in Westminster is with this currently. You know, in the media, certainly the focus seems to have shifted to student encampments, whether that's in the US or here in the UK, and we're seeing less and less discussion of the actual, almost the situation on the ground in Gaza, although what we are also seeing is louder and louder calls around the ending of arms sales. So just to sort of get your your insight into where the mood is in Westminster currently.
Well, just before I come to Westminster, I think you're right to say that we should always consider that there are children, women, and men, civilians, who are suffering unbelievable deprivation and horror on their daily lives, or at least trying to live their lives in this situation. And I think we mustn't be drawn away by the focus on things that are happening elsewhere around this from that fact. And the facts are and still remain there needs to be an immediate ceasefire there. And the UK and the US need to stop shipping arms into Israel, which are being used in that action just now, which is causing so much of that pain and distress for people. The mood in Westminster has changed slightly. I think the fact that the US has switched position, that the Labour Party during the local elections had an effect from some of the communities who've been rightly let down by their approach to what's happening in Gaza, has changed some of the rhetoric. But look, talk is important. We've got to make the right statements, but unless it's followed up by some kind of action, it's very cheap. At the moment, the only thing that remains on the books in terms of calling for a ceasefire is what happened as a result of the SNP opposition day, which famously was taken over so that the motion could be watered down by the Labour Party. Since then, as I say, we've seen a bit more talk about the fact that there should be a ceasefire, but still no action. It's absolutely incredible that the US, even Biden is talking about suspension of arms sales, and the UK government still cling to this proposition that they'll take it under legal advice. They won't publish that legal advice. They won't show the legal advice, and they won't do anything about that at the moment. And the fact that they're continuing to sell arms into Israel is just plainly morally indefensible. They need to stop that as an absolute minimum. Don't forget that's an absolute minimum. And they have to listen to some of the calls, to allow some safe haven for some families. There's been some moves to, I've called for it myself, for even if it's only the, allowing the families of those people who are now British citizens to come and get temporary shelter. They should be allowing something like that. But ultimately, this is a big mess. I think it has gone past the point where action should be taken. Westminster has proved itself incapable of leading. The Tory UK government have proved themselves incapable of leading on this, and shamefully so of the government in waiting, the Labour Party in the UK, by not being strong enough with this. And we need to be telling the international community that the UK doesn't stand for what's happening just now, and there should be an immediate ceasefire and a halt to arms sales.
Well, so as you say, the repercussions of this also extend to the UK and will affect how the UK is seen on an international stage. Turning to you, Hugh, how do issues like this around foreign policy tend to be received in Wales? That's something that obviously doesn't tend to receive much attention media-wise, as it also does not here in Scotland enough. But I'd love to sort of hear your reaction to issues like this. Obviously, Gaza is currently a very significant one, as is the war in Ukraine, but sort of more broadly as well within the structure of the UK.
Yeah, I think it does get lots of attention. I think from the war in Ukraine, the Mick Anthony, who is a member of the Welsh Government, Labour member, is Ukrainian. So that's brought that element to the fore. But I think with Gaza, because as you've just said now, it's the SNP supported by Plaid Cymru who've been pushing for the ceasefire. But what's interesting as well in Wales is the fact that the Senedd, including the Labour members, voted for a ceasefire. So there are differences between the politics here, Westminster, and in Scotland. it is one of those things, because obviously, clearly, the people's priorities are cost of living crisis, health, education. Those are the things that do get the priority. But I think especially amongst younger people, there's an interest there. I just noticed the people that I sort of associate with, you'll find the older generation are the ones who are going to be slightly more biased towards Israel, whereas younger people, see the situation, in Palestine and Gaza, but also the historical context of it more clearly. So although we're in an age of sort of mass information, disinformation, I think a lot of people now are able to see that what's going on in Israel is a challenge. And I think what's interesting now as well, you've got Benny Gantz. Obviously, he made the statement yesterday. So you've got three people in the war cabinet: Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant. So two out, have said that Netanyahu needs to set out his plans for Gaza. So no, it is interesting, and I think the fact that younger people are leading, the activism, which is a positive thing, I think.
Well, no, absolutely. As you said, there has been increased interest in examining Britain's, imperial and colonial past in the last decade. I would say that has come much more to the fore. But an issue such as Gaza or Palestine, I think, also brings that very much into contact with the present day, where we can much more clearly see, imperial and colonial legacies at work still than, when we're dealing with, states that haven't existed for, 50 or 80 years at this point. So I think that absolutely is instructive, and obviously particularly so for a new generation, sort of seeing the world for the first time in that way. Now, turning to Keir Starmer's speech this week, the big 6-step plan announcement, which included promising to stabilise the economy, cutting NHS waiting times, setting up the Great British Energy Company, a crackdown on antisocial behaviour, and the recruitment of 6,500 new teachers. What doesn't seem to have sort of ranked onto this is what Gordon Brown was pleading for, a focus on reducing child poverty and poverty more generally, as well as scrapping the very unpopular 2-child cap. So I think sort of looking at those pledges, comparing them to what we've had so far from Keir Starmer all the way back to the Labour leadership election, Drew, what would be your reaction to these sort of key points that have been pulled out clearly in the sort of the early stages of forming a manifesto for the coming election?
Well, I think the thing that's missing, and it's actually the thing you finished with in terms of the list there, was what's not on it. And you were talking about Gordon Brown, talking about child poverty. He didn't mention what's happening here in Scotland with the Scottish Child Payment, where we've put food on the table of 100,000 children through the SNP's Scottish Child Payment that they wouldn't have had food. They would have been still in poverty if that action hadn't been taken. And the fact that the 2-child cap, the rape clause, is going to continue under a new Labour government. The complete absence of anything on the cost of living should be an absolute warning bell to anybody looking at what Labour are doing at the moment in terms of their pledges. They have avoided throughout the Chancellor's autumn statement and in his budget in the spring talking about the cost of living at all, because as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they've joined together in what they call, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, called a conspiracy of silence over the cuts that are going to be required following the austerity measures that the Tories have been running for 14 years, and now the Labour Party have pledged to continue by following the same fiscal rules. So these pledges are basically so bland that even when Wes Streeting was on the BBC this morning, even he couldn't remember them and actually forgot some of the measures in there. As I say, nothing on the cost of living. When they're talking about stabilising the economy, I was listening to Alistair Campbell the other night saying that, and don't agree on a lot with Alistair Campbell, but he was saying that how can Labour the Labour Party possibly talk about stabilising the economy when they're still wedded to Brexit? And there's no attempt to sort out our relationship with the European Union. Indeed, they've become just as much Brexiteers as the Tories and the Liberal Democrats going forward. But they talk about cutting waiting times, and but that basically is shorthand for privatising the NHS and actually taking more funding out of the NHS as a result of doing that. The GB Energy pledge is hollow. We know that they've reversed their commitment to £28 billion a year, which is required for the green transition into new energy and indeed to tackle climate change. They've completely reversed on that position and abandoned that. And their plans for taxation are going to cost up to 100,000 jobs in the northeast of Scotland. These are the things that they're doing. So they're meaningless words. When they talk about tackling antisocial behaviour, what lesson, what measure of example does it show when they're welcoming right-wingers like Natalie Elphicke onto the Labour benches? And again, I come back to the new teachers. Again, how are they going to fund that when we've got at least a £20 billion hole in unprotected services across the UK, which ultimately will also have consequentials for Scotland, because consequentials have consequences here. So they're not looking to fill that. There'll be cuts coming up. I just think it is bland and meaningless. I think they're taking for granted that they're probably right. They're going to win because the Tories are just so awful. That the Labour Party are going to form the next UK government by default. But this isn't inspiring. It doesn't say anything. There's no detail in it. And there's nothing about the important things that are affecting people now: their rents, their mortgages, the cost of their energy bills that, okay, we might be going through the summer and prices will come down a bit, but they're still going to be much, much higher than they were a few years ago. Ordinary things like the cost of car insurance, which has gone through the roof. Nothing about tackling any of these things, or the cost of food, which has gone up by more than a quarter over the past couple of years because of Brexit. These are all things they should be focusing on and talking about investing in the economy, but they only do that in the most kind of bland and uninspiring ways that have no detail put behind them. So it's about time they came under a lot more scrutiny than just getting away with this kind of this kind of trick where they're saying, here's some pledges, but nothing behind it.
Now, the Labour government in Wales is often sort of held up as an exemplar of what a future UK Labour government would look like. Hugh, how do these pledges sort of hit your ear when you are living under a Labour Welsh government? How does that sort of seem to align with how they are currently running the Welsh government? And do you see this in the same way, as essentially sort of quite bland, quite generic, not really actually giving much detail?
Yeah, completely. I agree with everything that's just been said. When you look at the situation with teachers, for example, so 6,000 new teachers. Obviously, that's the other thing is, education is devolved. So they're talking about teachers in England. And so in Wales, that would equate to about 450 new teachers, which is, it's just, it's meaningless. It's not going to have any impact. The big issue we have in Wales, and I'd imagine it's the same across the rest of the UK, is the retention of teachers. How do we ensure teachers are staying? I'm a governor in a primary school and a secondary school, and we're facing really tough budgets for next year, for 24-25, and we're having to look at sort of making cuts. And if you think about the majority of schools, over 90% of the expenditure of a school is on staff, then you'll be aware then that if you are making cuts, then it is that. So people who are on not being able to renew contracts, and that is going to have an impact on education. But also we were discussing poverty. Wales has been under the Labour government since the inception of devolution here in 1999. We've got 1 in 3 children in Wales living in poverty. In some parts of places like South Wales Valleys, you've got 1 in 2. And these are places that have voted, pin a rosette on a donkey a red rosette, and people will vote for it. And it is this, so the situation in Wales is it's the finger pointing. It's, I keep describing it, it's that Spider-Man meme. That people criticise Welsh Labour, saying, well, education here, performances when you're based on PISA are worse than England and Scotland. The health service here is performing worse than in England and Scotland. So you got Labour criticising the SNP on the length of waiting lists. So the situation is much, much worse here in Wales. So one thing is saying these things, but actually enacting them and getting some sort of results. Are another thing. And as you say, things like, anti-social behaviour. Everybody wants to see anti-social behaviour reduced, but a lot of that is due to poverty. So, it's not being able to sort of get to the root of these things, and you need to have an economic plan to actually reignite and regenerate the communities that have been left behind under the Conservatives the last 14 years. And to be honest, Rachel Reeves as a Chancellor fills me, with about as much enthusiasm as, sort of going out and setting fire to my beard. And people like Wes Streeting, Lisa Nandy, it's just this, bland wanting to appeal to Conservatives. It's uninspiring, and they're rather than putting out a positive message and a different message and a radical message, all they're concerned about is winning over enough Conservative voters for them to win the election, and just expecting the rest of, society to vote for them, because who would vote Conservative, today? So, we're going to have a Labour government by default. And it's going to be interesting, because I think that's one thing we're going to discuss it later on, is there's going to be far more scrutiny of what Labour are doing in Wales, because it's going to be raised on the doorstep, health in Wales, education in Wales, things that Labour run that they're not very good at doing it.
Yes, absolutely. And we will be coming on to looking at the situation in Wales in a bit more detail in terms of the goings on in the Senedd currently. But just one last point I wanted to bring in on sort of Labour's pledges. As you said, Drew, the many things are conspicuous by their absence here. One of them that strikes me is no reference to Labour's immigration policy. In this instance, we've heard that the Rwanda plan is to be scrapped, apparently, and to be replaced by a new immigration command, supposedly taking primarily people smugglers to task. Why isn't that policy here? That's clearly something that they additionally want to sort of tack to their wagon in terms of giving themselves the legitimacy of a sort of centre-right party. Drew, starting with you, kind of, what do you expect to see, or what role do you expect to see immigration play for the Labour Party in terms of its coming manifesto?
Well, immigration should be playing a very positive role, but it's not. The reason it should be playing a positive role is that I referred to Brexit a few moments ago, and the unfolding disaster that's been, as it was predicted to be, in terms of the economy and impact and everything else like that. But they're talking about recruiting, teachers. They haven't said how they're going to do it and so forth, and investing in the NHS, which they haven't actually put any figures on because we know they're going to privatise it. But the real problem across all of the industries, and be it in education, health, social care, even into the private sector, tourism and hospitality, and a range of other things, is that there is a workforce shortage. So immigration, particularly for places like Scotland, and I'm sitting here talking to you from the Highlands, where we have an issue of needing people to come here and perform carry out the jobs that we need to have filled, so that we can grow the economy and contribute to the general well-being across the piece. We need people to come here. So they could choose to talk about the advantages of putting schemes in that will allow students to come and train here and perhaps stay here and use their skills when they're qualified to come here. But they're not doing that. That's very conspicuous by its absence. What they are doing is they're following a pattern of trying to tack as close as they possibly can to the issues that are put forward by the Tory party for the reasons that Hugh just mentioned. They want to encourage as many Tory voters across as they can, and in doing so, they're not only missing out on the big opportunity, but they're continuing to support a system which is inhumane in terms of, if you just look at asylum seekers, there are no safe routes. They keep saying that people shouldn't come across on boats and they should use other ways to get here, but neither the Tories nor the Labour Party, as you're talking about in this situation, have come up with a promise about safe routes and legitimate ways for asylum seekers to seek the safety that they need here. So they've missed an opportunity. They're tacking to the right, and it's just as simple as that. And it is something that is to their shame that they're continuing to do that. They're not being, Hugh talks about radical. I would talk about just being sensible, looking at economic policies, just being relatively human about the whole situation. But they're failing to do that because they just want to track those Tory votes.
And I imagine the situation in Wales with regards to the need for immigration and also the potential positives to the economy, society, etc., applies just as much in Wales as well.
Yeah, and especially when you're looking at things like health and social care. A lot of health and social care pre-Brexit was delivered by people from Europe, mainly Eastern Europe. But what we're seeing now is there's an influx now of bringing people in from Africa to do those jobs. And we've heard of some. I was talking to a friend last week who runs a news platform that looks at women who have, immigrant women to globally and the challenges they face. And and there are some horror stories about people. We heard them before about people being sort of brought in from from the Eastern Europe and treated badly. But we've got people from Africa now who have been promised the world, who have to pay money, and they're ending up living in poverty. So the jobs that people, the immigrants that are allowing them to do are ones that just we need just for society to function, for the economy to grow and develop. You need to develop that. But as Drew was saying, with Starmer, it's not a case of saying, well, yeah, we do need immigration. Economics show that you have to have a certain level of immigration in order to have an economy. But it's all about stopping the boats. It's not about safe routes. It's all about I'm tough macho. I'm going to smash the gangs. I've done it in the past when I was DPP. Like I say, but it's a narrative that is just pandering to people on the right, and I'd imagine in lots of places, like the Red Wall, and in places like in Wales, where people, immigration was a big part of the Brexit vote, but because people were lied to, that immigrants were taking your jobs, they were taking school places. I think it was Isabel Oakeshott posted a video about about mass immigration, people coming in small boats because the train was full. It was full of white people. You know what I mean? The reason trains are full is because the transport in this country is an absolute mess because of the government we've got.
Well, turning to Wales fully now, Plaid Cymru has ended its cooperation agreement with the Labour-led government in Wales this week. Rwy'n ap Iorwerth, the Plaid leader, said that he was deeply concerned over Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething's refusal to hand back a £200,000 donation from a company whose owner was convicted of environmental crimes. Gething could now be facing a no-confidence vote in the Welsh Senedd. So, obviously, as I'm sure we're all aware, the devolved parliaments tend to not get the coverage they really need within the UK. That's certainly the case for the Scottish Parliament. It's certainly also the case for the Welsh Synod. Hugh, could you kind of explain to us in a little bit more detail, and also to our viewers who are potentially not as clued in with Welsh parliamentary politics, kind of where we're at now and how we've gotten here?
So just a brief potted history, and I think, people in Scotland might sort of find this curious when you think that it's a Labour administration we have in Wales. So we had Mark Drakeford, who was the First Minister, who came to prominence at a UK level during COVID because, he was seen doing his daily announcements. He announced at the last Senedd election that he would be standing down during this term and to allow a new leader to come in to take Welsh Labour into the next Senedd election. So he stood down just before, announced he was standing down before Christmas. There was an election campaign to find a new leader for Labour in Wales, and that was decided by Labour members and people who were affiliated through the unions. There were two candidates, Vaughan Gething, who won, and Jeremy Miles, who was the Education Minister. It was very close. Vaughan Gething won by 51.7 to 48.3. So, that old 52-48 split came in. The controversy arose was because it came to light that Vaughan Gething had accepted £200,000 for his campaign to seek leadership of Welsh Labour. £200,000 in that context is a huge amount of money in Welsh politics. When you think that, I think Jeremy Miles had a total of something like 40,000 to run his campaign. Vaughan Gething had raised almost like £250,000. The £200,000 was given by a company who one of its directors had previously been convicted of dumping waste in the Gwent levels, which is a protected area, and then also convicted again for failing to clear it up. So a lot of people have questioned his integrity and his wisdom, because he, when challenged on receiving that amount from somebody with suspect character, his answer is, I haven't broken any rules, and he hasn't. But it questions his integrity. Also, last week it came to light that at the COVID inquiry, Vaughan Gething was saying that he hadn't deleted any messages, that his phone had been gone in to be repaired or something, or updated by the technical people at the Senedd, and had come back with everything wiped. So he hadn't deleted anything. Anyway, a message was leaked to the media during COVID, which included ministers, including Vaughan Gething, with Vaughan Gething saying he was deleting these messages because they could be sought through a Freedom of Information request. So again, that contradicts the evidence that he gave at the COVID inquiry. So as a result of that, he sacked Hannah Blythen, who was a junior minister who was looking after social care, claiming that she was the source of the leak. She's denied that completely. There was an emergency meeting. Then, as a result of that, Plaid Cymru, who had been in a cooperation agreement, not a coalition, so they didn't have any ministers, but they did agree to cooperate on a number of terms, and some of them, have been very successful. Things like free school meals, universal free school meals, have proved to be popular and needed. Anyway, on Friday, following Hannah Blythen's sacking, Rhyn ap Iorwerth, the Plaid leader, following a discussion with the Plaid Cymru NEC and the group, unanimously decided to bring the agreement to an end. So they had another 7 months to run. But the issue is because obviously Labour have 30 members, so that and it's a 60-member parliament. So they need the support of Plaid or the one Lib Dem in order to get things through. So that means now that they can't guarantee that support. And then as a result of that, the Conservatives are trying to table a motion of no confidence. So it'll be surprising if, for him to lose that vote, it would require one of the Labour members to abstain, not be available that day to vote. And if I was somebody who'd been sacked and accused of something which that they think was false, then that person isn't going to be inclined to vote. So yeah, it's a mess for Labour, and I'd imagine now that Keir Starmer is going to be keeping an eye on this. He doesn't want any kind of stink anywhere near Labour in the run up to a general election. So I think he is really living on borrowed time now.
So you would argue that you think most likely Von Gething will resign at some point as a result of, obviously, as you've pointed out, this is not solely the issue of political donations. There's also been some talk about the Welsh government's history of financially supporting the company in question as well, which adds further potential issues around.
So that, it is complicated because again, the same day that the donation was made, an application was made to build a solar farm. So obviously, Vaughan Gething saying, well, that he would not be involved in that, but it would be his government who made that decision, and they've also received a loan from the Development Bank of Wales, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Welsh Government. So they were borrowing money from Welsh Government whilst being able to afford to give a minister £200,000. So yeah, no, it is a mess. And I think, it was interesting when you think about Hamza Yousaf, thinking he didn't realise potentially that the Greens we're going to turn around and say, well, actually, no, we're not going to play ball anymore, seeing as you just sacked us. And, that was basically, seen as his judgment was placed into question. And that's the issue here with Vaughan Gething, is his judgment and integrity, the fact that he doesn't think that there are any issues. And the other sad thing that's come out is they had a meeting of all the Labour Senate members, the majority of which didn't back him in the leadership campaign. So he has got a tough job there because the majority don't support him, and a number of them are quite vocal about their dislike of his of him as a leader. But he claimed that anybody who was being critical of him were doing it because of racism. And the Welsh Labour BAME chair came out and published a statement online saying that the scrutiny from the Welsh media had crossed a line, and people have been questioning that and asking questions. Well, where's the evidence of this? And there isn't any. There has been in the English press in places like the Daily Mail, where they called Vaughan Gething and Hamza Yousaf pygmies. So there is obviously sort of in the right wing press, but in the Welsh media hasn't been. It's been scrutiny, so it's just being handled very badly. I don't know who's advising him, but it's not going well for him.
No, absolutely. As you said, racism exists across UK politics, in Scottish politics, in Welsh politics, but at the same time, it's not a blanket defence when what's actually being scrutinised is your ethics, is financial issues around government and transparency. Zooming out a little bit, Drew, how would you potentially compare the current situation in Wales to the situation in Scotland? Do you see potential parallels in terms of how the media approaches this? And also, I'm wondering, will this issue currently, and also the impending Labour Westminster government, will that, do you think, draw a lot more scrutiny towards the Senedd and Welsh Labour's current policies and record in office?
Well, I don't think the two situations between the SNP Butte House agreement with the Greens and the situation with Plaid in Wales are directly comparable. But I will come on to cover your other points in a wee second. I think Plaid Cymru have done a great job of pushing forward things that we touched on there, like the free school meals and so forth, and using their ability to negotiate across the Senate by getting these things through. And I think that's was working well when they were when Mark Drakeford was the First Minister, the Labour First Minister in the Senate. They're absolutely right when they feel they can't get anywhere else with that, and they are looking at the situation where there are things that they're concerned with to withdraw their support. And I think just touching on that, your question about the media, I think if the £200,000 donation, any £200,000 donation, is a massive amount of money in politics. Even in UK politics, that's a massive donation to get from a single individual or company. And I think that would have drawn in a scrutiny across the UK media if it happened with an SNP minister. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it is important that as Labour approach government, that their record in Wales is scrutinised properly. I don't think that happens enough in the UK media. I don't think there's enough comparison when we hear Wes Streeting only this morning, and we referred to this earlier in the programme, talking about the Labour health problems being down to funding from Westminster and not accepting that there's a correlation when there are issues in Scotland. And don't forget, in almost every measure, would be it waiting times, cancer waiting times, or whatever, Scotland outperforms not only the Welsh Labour position, but the NHS in England in terms of most of these metrics of doctors, nurses, and staff are paid more. We have more per head of population because we've invested more. And contrary to Rishi Sunak's assertions at almost every Prime Minister's questions, the funding has been cut in England, has actually been increased in Scotland. So we don't get enough comparison of these things in the UK media. I think it is incumbent on them to look at Labour's record where they are in power and actually put that under some scrutiny. There's no doubt that across all of the services across the UK and all the, whether it's in the Scottish Parliament, whether it's under the control of the Welsh Parliament or the UK Parliament, that the services are not where we need them to be. But all of that comes down to a proper plan for investment, and that investment means not only money, but it means people and where we're going to get them, and it isn't connected up enough. So I'm hoping there will be some real scrutiny coming forward in the next couple of months.
Now, turning back to Scotland, this week the Scottish Government declared a housing emergency. The Housing Minister, Shirley-Anne Somerville, said that this emergency is a result of factors including Brexit and the austerity and economic incompetence of the UK government. She has called for parties in Scotland to work together and unite to call for the UK government to reverse the 9% cut to Scotland's capital budget, a crucial factor in terms of constructing new housing stock. Now, Drew, what exactly is the significance of a housing emergency? Is this, is this something simply to draw attention to how bad the situation is currently? What does this lead to a change in terms of policy or approach? Give us a little bit more sort of context on that and what it means for Scottish Government policy.
Well, I'm glad the Scottish Government have done this. I think it's really important to point out that this is a real issue affecting people across our nation. And, we're not unique. I think the situation in Wales, I'm sure we'll hear about that in a second, and the situation across the rest of the UK is also, an issue of an emergency in terms of housing. I think that's a matter of fact. The fact that here in Scotland we've been building many more council houses and houses for affordable rent and shared ownership than other parts of the UK still doesn't cure the problem that we have just now. And I think by admitting that there and calling this emergency, I think is a good step in terms of saying, look, we have to actually look at the root cause of all of this. And I agree that when you look at Brexit and you look at austerity, we are really very, very limited in what we're doing. The 9% cut that is being called for a reverse is just common sense. in terms of the fact that you can't build more. You just simply cannot build more if capital is being cut by that level. I would also add, by the way, that I think the Scottish Government are being really generous by talking about the fact that it's only 9%, because I think they've factored all of the available borrowing powers and everything else that they can possibly stretch every sinew with. When you look at the House of Commons library figure for this, the cut to the Scottish capital budget has actually been 16.1%. That's a massive cut. I referred to earlier on the fact that neither the Tories or Labour are facing up to the fact that there's a further minimum of 18 to 20 billion pounds. That's going to be compounded by additional defence spending, by the way. That's a hole in unprotected services, which means things like council funding and things that will follow through into capital spend for house building as well, if logic follows through, which it must do in this case, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have pointed that out. So there needs to be a recognition that this is an emergency, that the emergency is one of finance, it's one of austerity, it's one of Brexit. It can be solved, but it needs to be a state where we're actually saying, look, we need some investment. When Westminster decides to cut budgets for these things across the UK, it affects what's happening in Scotland, it affects what's happening in Wales, and there should be a concerted cross-party effort in Scotland to say, look, we need to all get together, regardless of colour of politics, to make sure that we're able to supply the housing in the future to do that. You can't do that without the funding to do it. And it is, I think, a welcome step that the Scottish Government has said, look, we can't do this alone. These consequentials, these Barnett consequentials have consequences. Let's get together and make sure we've made this really clear where the root of the issue is and try and get a solution, because this is an important issue for people. I talked about the cost of living earlier, the fact that people are really struggling just now. Some of the basics in life in terms of good mental health, good physical health, cutting down the costs for the NHS and making things more efficient are actually jobs and good housing, because those are the key fundamentals under almost every study that show when you want to increase the well-being for people, these are the things you've got to tackle. So I think it's a good step. I think it's a welcome thing to do, to say that this isn't something that can be solved in isolation. I think that really other parties now should come together with the SNP, with the and say, if you really are concerned about this, let's look at getting some solutions for it.
Well, as you say, Drew, adequate housing, whether that's rented or owned or council, is absolutely key to well-being. There was a sort of research done that came out in the last weeks around mental well-being, with the UK scoring really shockingly badly, second bottom of that league table, only underperformed by Uzbekistan. So I think that really should be quite an eye-opening moment for self-reflection, and also to think not just around the sort of the personal well-being implications, but actually how government policy around things like housing, around the necessities of life, absolutely informs the mental health of the nation. Now, Hugh, how would you say the housing situation is currently in Wales? Is this also at a sort of an emergency, at a crisis level? And again, sort of how much responsibility is the Welsh Government currently bearing, or can you also similarly see the knock-on effect of Barnett consequentials there as well?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it is something that, again, that was trying to be dealt with through the cooperation agreement between Labour and Plaid Cymru, especially in sort of rural areas. We have a huge issue in Wales where rural communities, especially coastal areas where tourism is prolific, with people, sort of house prices just being out of reach of especially younger people. So people are being forced out of the communities that they grew up in because they can't literally afford to buy properties there. There is a scheme that's just been launched now where people with empty properties can get help with funding in order to make those houses habitable, in order to get into the housing chain. But I think one of the big issues, and this is something that is raised on a basis, especially from in fairness to local authorities, is having the budget set on an annual basis doesn't allow people to plan for the long term, and I think that is one of the biggest issues. Is you need to have that long term stability plan in order to sort of put these things into place. So just finding out every year what your budget's going to be, and obviously with Barnet Consequential, so you get Michael Gove coming up with an idea, then all of a sudden, we're giving. So it's just that being forced. Okay, you get some money for it, but being forced down roads that maybe you don't want to actually go down because it's a consequence of what Conservative government is doing in Westminster. But no, definitely, it is a huge issue, and especially amongst younger people. It's one of the main things we're going to be discussing on the doorstep. But it is a challenge when developers are given planning to build new housing estates. That there's a promise that there's going to be a percentage of affordable housing, but when it comes down to it, when it comes to build it, the builders will say, well, we can't afford to have that level of affordable housing as part of the mix. So that's the issue as well, just from an economics, because of the cost of living and the fact that sort of materials and things have risen. So plans that were put in place sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago, when it comes to actually doing it, they're just not financially viable anymore.
Well, as you said, short-termism and housing are just really factors that do not mix well when you consider that people seeking housing will be seeking to use it for a decade, 2 decades, the rest of their life necessarily, and it really is not conducive to actually finding stability or improving particularly the accessibility of low-income housing. Also, as you said, this particularly affects young people, which leads me to our final point for today, which is that Young Scots for Independence have held their Scotland and Europe conference in Stirling with delegates from Scotland and across the EU. The conference aimed to boost international support for Scottish independence and for Scotland rejoining the EU following independence. Now, Drew, I believe you were at the conference. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of an overview about sort of the main points that came out of it and a bit of a sort of an impression of just how the day went.
Well, it was a great thing to be involved in. I was on a panel talking about the situation across the world just now, with forces moving to the right of politics and with authoritarianism creeping in. But I know that during the entire conference, they've been talking about all the issues that are affecting young people, the possibilities and opportunities with independence, the issues that they're all facing just now. And we've touched on it a couple of times in this programme today, but the issues that they're facing in terms of the removal of their rights and opportunities through Brexit. So their ability to travel, to study, to work, to live in other countries, and of course the ability for people from other EU countries to come here and do the same was obviously a running theme throughout all this. But I think one of the most impressive things was the high energy that was there about people just not willing to take for granted the fact that that things are difficult. One of the themes I think we see all through politics just now is that people are a bit switched off to politics. They feel it's not really working for them, and of course that's what those who would impose authoritarian regimes, those who would push forward things like Brexit and all these horrible policies in terms of making the UK more insular and other countries more insular. That's what they want. They want people to be hacked off and to be apathetic about voting. But they weren't willing to take that. They were enthusiastic about the fact that they have got a voice and they must make it heard. They were coming up with some really interesting and thoughtful ways to carry forward cooperation across different countries. There were delegates there from Germany, from Ukraine, Ukraine, and there were also from many other countries as well that had come across to show their interest in that. So it was a very, very busy, active conference. I was absolutely impressed by the fact that even though it was a boiling hot day, and the room was quite stifling. That it was just a very packed room of very enthusiastic people with some great ideas and a lot of commitment to being progressive, to being inclusive, to being internationalist, and to looking to the future. And that's exactly, I think, what we want from young people in politics. And they look as though they're ready to accept the mantle of responsibility for making decisions that will affect them into the next decades and, of course, into the future. And that's exactly what they should be doing, rather than leaving it to others to shape the world that they're going to be living in.
Is that something that you observe in Wales as well, Hugh, in terms of a lot of energy, particularly coming from the young with regards to independence still? I think that you can say that applies in both Scotland and Wales, that there is sort of higher levels of backing among younger people. But why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously the polling in Wales, it's up now to around sort of 30%. But when you look at younger people under 25s, it's much higher, and it is that skew. You've got the older generation, 60 plus, who are very anti-independence or pro-union, and then you've got the younger generation who are more for. I just think younger people now are just more connected to the world. They because of people criticise the internet and social media, but knowledge, sharing knowledge, and being able to see things and just understanding, sort of being in, independent is normal, and it's just having that control over your own future and decisions. And it has been helped by having an awful government in Westminster, because that's a huge turnoff. Because in Wales we've never voted, for a Conservative majority, so that is something clearly that people in Wales don't want to see, especially young people. I think younger people more today than ever are more sort of radical in their thinking, and they're thinking more about their own futures, and they're realizing that their futures are being threatened under this like austerity government.
Well, that's a very good point. There's often a lot of rhetoric around young people fighting for causes that are seen as sort of irrelevant to their lives, but people are deeply concerned about what their futures will look like, and I think the questions of independence, both in Wales and in Scotland, are absolutely intertwined with that. Well, that's all we've got time for today. That's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I would just like to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland we depend on donations and the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford to donate £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Thank you to my guests, Drew Hendry MP and Hugh Marshall. I'm Seán Pieper. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good Sunday. Goodbye.
Thank you.